I am Joshua, 35 years old, and my own brother kicked me out into the freezing snow just days after our parents' funeral, tossing me the keys to an abandoned factory. Before I tell you about how I legally stripped him of his multi-million-dollar empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. It was 2 in the morning, and the marble floor of the Manhattan penthouse was radiating a bone-chilling cold that seeped right through my socks. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, a brutal New York snowstorm was whipping against the glass, blurring the glittering skyline into a smudge of gray and harsh yellow streetlights. But the storm outside was nothing compared to the absolute freezing reality inside that living room. Less than 2 weeks had passed since the funeral. The scent of those overly sweet, expensive white lilies still seemed to hang in the air, mixing with the smell of the sterile medical supplies I hadn't had the heart to throw away yet. I was standing in the center of the massive foyer, my eyes burning from a kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. I was looking at the 2 people who were supposed to be my family. My older brother, Julian, leaned casually against the custom-carved oak doorframe leading to the dining room. He was wearing a dark silk robe, his hair perfectly styled even at this hour, casually swirling a glass of amber scotch. His wife, Victoria, stood a few feet away, her arms tightly crossed over a beige cashmere sweater. She looked at me the way you look at a stray dog that had somehow tracked mud onto a Persian rug. For 6 grueling, heartbreaking years, this penthouse was my entire universe. Not because of the luxury, not because of the private elevator or the panoramic views of Central Park, but because of the heavy, mechanical hospital bed we had set up in the master bedroom. When our father's health failed, and our mother's mind started to slip soon after, a decision had to be made. Julian, of course, was too busy building his empire. He claimed his hotel business needed him, that he couldn't step away. So I did. I gave up my career in commercial property valuation. I gave up my salary. I watched the promotion I had worked 4 years for go to a junior associate. I packed up my life and moved into the guest room of this penthouse to become a full-time caregiver. I bathed our father when he no longer had the strength to stand. I crushed our mother's medications and mixed them into applesauce, patiently feeding her while she asked me who I was. I spent countless nights awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic hum of the oxygen concentrator, terrified that if the machine stopped, I wouldn't hear it in time. And Julian was the golden child. He visited on major holidays, usually pulling up to the building in his brand new Porsche. He would ride the private elevator up, drop off a bouquet of incredibly expensive, impersonal flowers, take a few carefully posed photos with our ailing parents for his social media, and leave before the real, ugly work of caregiving started. He always patted my shoulder on his way out, slipping me a patronizing smile like I was the hired help doing a satisfactory job. Now, the medical equipment was gone. The penthouse was quiet, and Julian was making his move. "It's time for you to go, Joshua," Julian said, taking a slow sip of his scotch. The ice clinked against the crystal glass. "The estate is entering probate, but as the primary executor, I'm making some immediate executive decisions about the properties." "It's 2 in the morning, Julian," I said, my voice hoarse. My throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. "Can we at least talk about this after the sun comes up? I haven't even finished sorting through Mom's things." Victoria scoffed, a sharp, ugly sound that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. "We have high-end interior designers coming tomorrow at 8 in the morning, Joshua. We are completely gutting this place. I absolutely refuse to have them see you dragging your depressing, thrift store baggage through my new living room. It's a bad look for us." My new living room. She said it with such casual cruelty, erasing 6 years of my life, my sacrifice, in 4 words. Julian reached into the pocket of his silk robe. He pulled out a heavy, rusted ring of keys. The metal was dark orange, flaking, and looked like it belonged to a medieval dungeon rather than a piece of modern real estate. He didn't hand them to me. He tossed them across the marble floor. They hit the stone with a harsh, metallic clatter, sliding across the polished surface until they hit the toe of my shoe. "There," Julian said, his lips curling into a smirk. Your inheritance. The old factory over in Red Hook. Mom and Dad always joked that it suited your unrefined sensibilities. I'm keeping the penthouse, obviously. You get the brick pile. I stared down at the rusted metal. The Red Hook factory was a long-running family joke. It was a decrepit, abandoned brick shell sitting right on the waterfront in Brooklyn. It had been rotting there for decades. As far as anyone in the family knew, it was a massive, toxic liability, full of environmental hazards, structural decay, and property tax debt. Giving it to me wasn't a gift. It was an insult. It was Julian's way of telling me I was worthless. "You're throwing me out?" I whispered, the reality finally piercing through the fog of my grief. "I kept them alive for 6 years, Julian. You didn't even know Dad's favorite color. You didn't know Mom stopped eating solid food a year ago. And you're throwing me out." Julian's jaw tightened. The fake smile vanished. "I'm the older brother. I'm the successful one. I'm the one who knows how to manage wealth. You're unemployed, Joshua. You have no salary, no savings, and frankly, no ambition. Take the keys and get out of my house." Victoria checked the diamond watch glittering on her wrist. "You've got 5 minutes to pack your things. If you aren't in the elevator by then, I'm calling building security to have you removed for trespassing." I didn't scream. I didn't lunge at him, even though every muscle in my body, tight with adrenaline and betrayal, begged me to wrap my hands around his neck. I just looked at them, really looked at them. I saw the greed sweating out of their pores. I bent down, my fingers wrapping around the freezing cold, rusted keys. The flakes of rust dug into my palm like tiny needles. I turned my back on them. I walked down the long hallway to the small guest room I had lived in. I pulled my faded canvas duffel bag from under the bed and shoved my clothes, my laptop, and a small framed photo of my parents into it. I zipped it up, put on my heavy winter coat, and walked back out. They were already gone, retreated to the master bedroom. They didn't even stay to watch me leave. The elevator ride down felt like it took a lifetime. Dylan, the night concierge, was standing behind the marble desk in the lobby when the brass doors slid open. He looked at my duffel bag, then at my face, and his eyes widened. He knew me. He knew I never left at this hour. He opened his mouth to speak, but I just gave him a slight shake of my head. I walked out through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the biting wind of the New York winter. I stood on the snowy curb and ordered a ride-share on my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely type in the destination. A beat-up sedan pulled up 10 minutes later. A guy named Joseph was driving. He took one look at me in the rearview mirror, saw the bag, saw the snow in my hair and the hollow look in my eyes, and wisely decided not to make small talk. "Where to, man?" he asked quietly. "Red Hook, Brooklyn," I replied, my voice completely flat. The drive took almost an hour through the dark, icy streets. When Joseph finally pulled up to the curb near the waterfront, he put the car in park and turned around to look at me. The neighborhood was dead silent, illuminated only by a few flickering orange street lamps. "You sure about this, man?" Joseph asked, his brow furrowed with genuine concern. "There's nothing out here but rats and broken glass." I looked out the window. The factory loomed in the darkness like a massive, rotting beast. The brick walls were scarred and crumbling. The chain-link fence surrounding the perimeter was heavily damaged, blowing slightly in the freezing wind, scraping against the concrete. Half the windows on the upper floor were completely shattered, looking like hollow black eyes. "I'm sure," I said. I tipped him a $20 bill, grabbed my bag, and stepped out into the night. The wind off the East River was absolutely brutal. Cut through my wool coat like a serrated knife, biting into my skin. I stood on the cracked pavement, staring up at the monolithic brick structure that Julian thought was a fitting punishment for my years of loyalty. I walked up to the heavy steel side door. I fumbled with the rusted ring of keys, my fingers numb from the cold. I tried the first key. It wouldn't even slide into the lock. I tried the second. It went in but wouldn't turn. Finally, the third key, a thick, jagged piece of brass, slid in and turned with a heavy, satisfying click. I threw my shoulder against the steel door. The rusted hinges screamed into the quiet night as I shoved it open. I stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind me, plunging myself into pitch blackness. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating floating particles of dust. The air inside smelled like old engine oil, damp brick, and decades of decay. Debris was scattered everywhere. Overturned wooden pallets, rusted metal barrels, and shattered glass crunching under my boots. At first glance, the massive industrial floor looked exactly like what Julian had claimed it was. A worthless, toxic pile of junk. But I was a commercial property evaluator. Before my life became about heart monitors and pill organizers, my entire career was built on walking into spaces and seeing what others missed. I evaluate structures, systems, and hidden values for a living. And as my flashlight beam swept across the far wall, the analytical part of my brain, dormant for 6 years, suddenly snapped awake. Something here did not make sense. My light hit a massive electrical junction box bolted to the brick wall. The conduit pipes running out of it were old, but the box itself? The box was a modern, high-capacity industrial breaker panel, and there wasn't a speck of dust on it. I walked closer, my heart starting to beat a little faster against my ribs. I looked down at the concrete floor. The entire warehouse was covered in an inch of grime, but there was a distinct, clean pathway, about 3 feet wide, swept entirely clear of debris, leading straight from the side entrance toward the back administrative offices. Someone had been walking this path. Recently, I followed the clean concrete trail. It led me to a set of metal stairs in the back corner. I climbed them, the metal groaning slightly under my weight. As I reached the second floor landing, I noticed a subtle change. The air up here wasn't freezing. It wasn't warm exactly, but it was regulated. It lacked the bone-chilling dampness of the main floor. I walked into the main office area. It was a long corridor lined with old, dented filing cabinets and collapsed wooden desks. I started opening cabinets. Most were rusted shut, and the ones I could pry open were completely empty. But then, shoved behind a heavily damaged desk in the very back corner, my flashlight beam caught something out of place. It was a large, modern, waterproof cylindrical document tube. I dropped my duffel bag, knelt down, and pulled the tube out. I popped the heavy plastic cap off and tilted it. A roll of thick architectural blueprints slid into my hand. I spread them out over the top of the broken desk, shining my phone light over the sprawling lines. They were structural schematics for the factory. But they weren't original. They were heavily modified. And all over the margins, written in black ink, was my father's precise, narrow handwriting. I recognized his distinct double underlines immediately. I traced his notes across the paper. They detailed electrical rerouting, independent HVAC installation, and reinforced steel framing. I followed the lines until my finger stopped at a specific section of the wall right in front of me. According to the blueprint, there was a small, square room built directly into the back corner of the factory. I looked up. There was no door, just a solid wall of old brick, partially obscured by a massive, floor-to-ceiling steel filing cabinet. I walked over to the cabinet. I braced my boots against the floor, put my hands flat against the cold steel, and shoved with everything I had. It resisted at first, but then it rolled on hidden casters, sliding smoothly to the left. My breath caught in my throat. Hidden entirely behind the cabinet, perfectly blended into the surrounding brickwork with custom painting, was a solid steel, industrial-grade security door. It looked like the entrance to a bank vault. And right next to the heavy handle mounted flush into the wall was a small, sleek biometric fingerprint scanner. A tiny, steady red LED light glowed in the darkness. It had power, active power. Suddenly, a memory hit me like a physical blow. 10 years ago, my dad had dragged me out of my apartment on a Saturday morning. He drove me to this exact building. He told me it was just a routine inspection of a dead asset. He walked me up these stairs, brought me to this exact wall, and told me to put my hand on a small glass pad. I thought he was being eccentric. He just smiled, patted my shoulder, and muttered something about a man always needing a backup plan. My hand trembled violently as I lifted it. The cold air suddenly felt suffocating. I pressed my right thumb flat against the cold glass of the scanner. For a second, nothing happened. Then the scanner beeped. The red light flipped to a vibrant green. Deep inside the steel door, a heavy motorized deadbolt disengaged with a loud, mechanical thud that echoed through the empty factory. I grabbed the thick handle and pulled. The heavy door swung outward with a soft hiss, releasing a rush of dry, perfectly climate-controlled air. As soon as the door opened, motion sensors inside triggered a sequence of bright, recessed LED lights overhead. I stepped over the threshold and felt my reality completely shatter. I was standing in a room that looked like it belonged in a high-tech corporate headquarters in Silicon Valley, not a rotting Brooklyn factory. The floor was polished concrete, spotless enough to eat off of. Sleek, fireproof metal filing cabinets lined the walls. A massive, state-of-the-art server rack hummed quietly in the corner, its blue lights blinking steadily. In the center of the room sat a massive, beautiful oak desk. Resting directly in the center of the desk was a black encrypted USB drive, sitting on top of a sealed, pristine white envelope. My name was written on the envelope. Joshua. It was my father's handwriting. I walked over, my legs feeling like they were moving through deep water. I sat down in the heavy leather desk chair. I picked up the envelope, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I tore the paper open and pulled out a single sheet of heavy cardstock. Joshua, if you are reading this, it means the worst has happened. It means your mother and I are gone, and it means the people who only value appearances have finally shown you exactly who they are. Julian has always been blind to what matters. We knew he would take the shiny bait. We knew he would look at the penthouse and think he won. But true power doesn't need to show off, son. Now it is your turn to take the power. Look at the drive. Understand what you hold. Tears, hot and fast, finally spilled over my eyelashes. They tracked down my cold cheeks and dropped onto the letter. For 6 years I thought they didn't see me. I thought Julian was the favorite, the golden boy who got everything while I got the burden. But they knew. They knew exactly who he was, and they knew exactly who I was. I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve, a newfound fire igniting in my chest. I grabbed the USB drive and plugged it into the sleek laptop sitting on the desk. Password prompt appeared. I didn't even have to think. I typed in my mother's maiden name and my father's birth year. The screen flickered, and a massive directory of folders populated the screen. They were meticulously organized. I opened the primary folder, labeled Bennett Land and Title Holdings. I had never heard of this company in my entire life. I clicked through the corporate formation documents. My parents were the sole stakeholders, entirely hidden behind 3 layers of complex blind trusts. And I was listed as the sole executor and beneficiary. I opened the asset ledger. The factory in Red Hook was listed as the registered corporate address. But it wasn't the main asset. The factory was literally just a mailbox. I dug deeper, opening the folder labeled Land Surveys and Title Chains. I started reading the legal descriptions of the parcels owned by the holding company. My jaw dropped. The air left my lungs. Bennett Land and Title Holdings owned the ground rights to a massive commercial and residential parcel in Lower Manhattan. I read the address. I rubbed my eyes and read it again. It was the exact plot of land sitting directly underneath Julian's penthouse building. Julian didn't own the land. Nobody in that glittering glass tower owned the dirt it sat on. The entire luxury building was constructed on a 99-year commercial ground lease. My parents had quietly bought the underlying dirt 30 years ago during a market dip and never told a soul. I opened the master lease agreement. My eyes scanned the dense legal text, looking for the expiration terms. I scrolled down. I found the date. The 99-year lease expired in exactly 25 days. In commercial real estate, an expiring ground lease is a ticking time bomb. If a new lease agreement is not negotiated and signed by the property owners and the landowner before the expiration date, the landowner, which was now legally me, had the right to assume total ownership of the structures built on the property, or force a catastrophic renegotiation that would bleed the building owners dry. I leaned back in the chair, my mind spinning at 1,000 miles an hour. I opened another folder labeled Julian Financials. My father had been secretly tracking his golden boy. Julian had recently launched a massive, aggressively ambitious expansion of his luxury hotel brand. To fund it, he took out a colossal commercial loan. And what did he use as the primary collateral to secure that $40 million loan? His equity in the penthouse and his ownership stake in the building's management group. He leveraged a building sitting on rented dirt. If the bank found out the ground lease was expiring and the landowner was hostile, Julian's collateral would instantly evaporate. His loan would default. His empire would collapse overnight. My father's handwriting was scanned into the margins of the loan document. Vanity buyers never read the schedules. He thinks he owns the sky, but he forgot to check who owns the ground. The penthouse wasn't an inheritance. It was a trap, and Julian stepped right into it the second he threw those keys at me. I didn't sleep a single wink that night. I sat in that leather chair inside the biometric vault for 12 straight hours, reading every single contract, every trust document, every financial schedule on that USB drive until the legal jargon was burned into the back of my eyelids. By the time I finally leaned back and rubbed my burning eyes, the morning sun was trying to peek through the shattered windows of the factory above me. Suddenly, my phone vibrated violently against the heavy oak desk, shattering the absolute silence of the underground room. I picked it up, the screen illuminated with a name I had hoped not to see for a very long time. Julian. I stared at it. He was calling at exactly noon. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow, deep breath to steady my racing heart. I cleared my throat, forcing my voice to sound tired and defeated, and hit answer. Joshua. Hey, buddy. Julian's voice boomed through the speaker. It was his signature fake-friendly tone. The one he used when he was trying to charm an investor or close a bad deal. It was a tone completely devoid of the venom he had sprayed at me just 10 hours earlier. Julian, I said flatly, giving him absolutely nothing to work with. Listen, Victoria and I were talking this morning over breakfast. He continued, sounding incredibly casual, as if he hadn't just thrown his own blood onto the street at 2 a.m. during a snowstorm. We feel terrible about last night. We really do. Emotions were just running so incredibly high after the funeral. You know how it is. Grief makes us all do crazy things. We weren't thinking straight. Right? Grief, I echoed, staring at the multi-million-dollar ground lease document glowing on my laptop screen. Exactly, Julian said, seizing on my quiet tone, probably assuming I was depressed and desperate. Anyway, I was thinking about that factory. Mom and Dad meant well, they really did, but they really strapped you with a nightmare. I had my accountant run some preliminary numbers. The property taxes alone on that waterfront zoning are going to drown you in 6 months. Plus, there are environmental cleanup codes, structural liabilities, potential asbestos. It's a massive mess. You don't have the salary for that kind of upkeep anymore, Josh. Not since you quit your job. He paused, clearly waiting for me to sound panicked. Waiting for me to beg for help. I stayed completely, terrifyingly silent. So, Julian pressed on, his voice taking on the tone of a benevolent savior. I want to help you out. You're my brother. I'll buy the factory from you. $40,000. Cash. I actually had to cover my mouth to stop myself from laughing out loud. 40,000, I repeated, letting the number hang in the air. It's a very fair market value for a distressed asset, Julian lied smoothly. It gets you a nice apartment, gives you a fresh start, maybe a little college fund if you ever decide to go back to school. And I'll take on the headache of dealing with the city and the demolition. Consider it my way of making things right between us. $40,000. He was trying to buy a corporate holding company that controlled the ground rights to tens of millions of dollars in premium Manhattan real estate for the price of a mid-tier used sedan. He thought I was an absolute idiot. He thought I was just the pathetic, unemployed brother who had spent 6 years wiping counters and crushing pills, completely detached from the business world. "That's a very generous offer, Julian," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I know it is, buddy. I just want to look out for you. Let's meet for coffee today. I'll have my lawyer draft up a simple transfer deed. We sign it, I hand you a cashier's check, and you walk away clean and stress-free. Send me the address," I said. 3 hours later, I walked into a high-end, exposed brick cafe in Brooklyn Heights. It was the kind of pretentious place that charged $12 for a pour-over espresso and played indie acoustic music just a little too loudly. I stood by the counter and watched through the massive front window. Right on time, a sleek, midnight black Rolls-Royce pulled up to the curb, illegally parking in a loading zone. Victoria stepped out first. She was wearing a designer trench coat that cost more than my first car, holding a Birkin bag, and wearing oversized sunglasses that covered half her face. Julian followed, wearing a tailored navy suit that screamed Wall Street money. They walked in, looking around the cafe as if the air inside was somehow beneath them. They spotted me sitting in a corner booth. Victoria didn't even bother to take off her sunglasses as she slid into the booth across from me. She immediately pulled out her phone and started scrolling, completely ignoring my presence. Julian sat down, flashing his perfect, expensive porcelain veneers. He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't ask where I slept last night. He just reached inside his tailored jacket and slid a thick manila folder across the reclaimed wood table. "Here it is," Julian said, tapping the top of the folder. "Standard property transfer deed. My legal team rushed it this morning. Just sign at the bottom flags, and the 40 grand is yours. I've got the cashier's check right here in my pocket." I didn't open the folder. I didn't even touch it. I just looked at him. Julian was tapping his fingers rhythmically against his coffee cup. His leg was bouncing under the table, vibrating the floorboards slightly. His eyes kept darting to the folder, then to my hands, then back to the folder. For a guy doing his brother a charitable favor, he was radiating a massive amount of nervous energy. "You know," I said slowly, leaning back against the leather booth, 40,000 is a lot of liquid cash to drop on a toxic, rotting brick box that needs demolition. Why do you want it so badly, Julian?" Julian's smile tightened, the edges of his lips straining. "I told you on the phone, Josh. I'm taking a loss to help my brother out of a bad situation." "You don't take losses, Julian. You never have. Not in business, not in life." Victoria finally looked up from her phone. She lowered her sunglasses down the bridge of her nose, glaring at me with pure venom. "Joshua, don't be difficult. Julian is trying to throw you a lifeline. You have no job. You have no money. You are virtually homeless. Take the check before we change our minds and leave you to drown in legal fees and tax liens." Julian leaned forward, dropping the friendly, brotherly act entirely. His voice dropped to a low, threatening register, the kind of voice he used to bully contractors. "Sign the paper, Josh. If you want to play games, I promise you I will bury you. I have lawyers on retainer who make more in a week than you've made in your entire life. I will tie that property up in probate and environmental courts for the next decade. You won't see a single dime, and the city will seize it." I looked down at the manila folder. I saw the yellow sticky flags poking out of the edges, demanding my signature. Then I looked up, directly into Julian's eyes, dropping the defeated act completely. "You seem awfully tense for a man trying to buy a pile of garbage," I said, my voice cold and sharp. The color drained completely out of Julian's face, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the cafe's warm lighting. His jaw clenched so hard I saw the muscle pop violently near his ear. Victoria stiffened, her posture turning rigid, her phone slipping slightly in her hand. I stood up, slowly zipping my jacket. I looked down at them, feeling a surge of power I hadn't felt in years. "I'm going to pass on your generous offer," I said. "If you want to talk about my property again, you can contact my representation." I turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving the folder and the desperate, hypocritical golden boy sitting in silence. By the time I took the subway back to the Red Hook factory and locked myself inside the underground biometric vault, my phone was absolutely blowing up. Julian was panicking, and when Julian panicked, he attacked. His high-paid attack dog of a lawyer, a guy named Carter, sent me 3 emails in the span of an hour. I opened them on the laptop. They were massive, intimidating walls of aggressive legal text, designed to overwhelm a layperson. Carter threw around words like immediate municipal intervention, zoning violations, hazardous nuisance, and catastrophic personal liability. He claimed the city was preparing to seize the Red Hook factory due to severe code violations and that Julian's offer was the only thing standing between me and personal bankruptcy. It was a standard corporate bullying tactic. Drown the target in fear so they sign whatever you put in front of them just to make the nightmare stop. The next morning, the intimidation escalated from digital to physical. I was standing by the second-story window of the factory, drinking a cup of instant coffee, when a white city vehicle pulled up to the chain-link fence. A man wearing a thick jacket with the Department of Buildings logo on the back stepped out. He carried a clipboard and a camera. I watched as this inspector, a guy I later found out was named Luke, slowly walked the perimeter of the fence. He took pictures of the crumbling brick, the broken windows, and the rusted gate. He made a big show of shaking his head and writing furiously on his clipboard. I knew exactly what it was. Carter had called in a favor or slipped someone an envelope of cash to have Luke come out and rattle my cage. They wanted me to look out the window and feel terrified. They wanted me to think the walls of the city government were closing in on me. They didn't realize I was already sitting inside a fortress, holding the keys to their destruction. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a number I hadn't dialed in over 6 years. I hit call. Matthew Vance. A crisp, sharp voice answered on the second ring. Matthew was a commercial real estate attorney I used to work with closely before I quit my job to take care of my parents. He was ruthless, brilliant, incredibly detail-oriented, and he absolutely despised corporate bullies. We had won some major valuation disputes together in the past. Matthew, I said, it's Joshua Bennett. There was a brief pause on the line. Joshua? My God, it's been years. I heard about your parents passing. I'm so sorry, man. Thank you, I said. Listen, I need your help. Fast. I need you to come to an address in Red Hook, Brooklyn. And you need to bring your laptop. I've got a situation involving an expiring ground lease, a heavily leveraged commercial loan, and my brother. Text me the address, Matthew said, his tone instantly shifting from sympathetic friend to predatory lawyer. I'm on my way. Matthew arrived at the factory 2 hours later. He stepped out of a black town car wearing a sharp navy overcoat. I met him at the rusted side door and quickly pulled him inside. He looked around the dusty, debris-filled main floor, raising an eyebrow. You brought me all the way to Brooklyn for a haunted house tour? He asked dryly. Just follow me, I said. I walked him to the back of the factory, moved the heavy filing cabinet, and placed my thumb on the biometric scanner. When the heavy steel door hissed open and the bright LED lights flared to life, illuminating the pristine, high-tech vault, Matthew stopped dead in his tracks. Joshua? Matthew breathed, stepping over the threshold and looking around the secure room in absolute disbelief. What the hell is this place? This, I said, walking over to the oak desk, is Mom and Dad's real legacy. I sat him down in front of the laptop and showed him everything. I walked him through the Bennett Land and Title Holdings corporate structure. I showed him the title chains, the land surveys, and the master ground lease that sat underneath Julian's luxury penthouse. And most importantly, I showed him Julian's massive, heavily leveraged commercial loan documents that my father had intercepted. Matthew read the screen in absolute silence for almost 20 minutes. The only sound in the room was the hum of the servers and the clicking of his mouse. When he finally looked up, he had a massive, dangerous smile spreading across his face. Your brother is a dead man walking, Matthew said softly, shaking his head in awe. He leveraged a $40 million building that he doesn't own the dirt under. When this ground lease expires in exactly 3 weeks, his collateral vanishes into thin air. The bank will immediately call the loan. He'll be in default. He won't just lose the penthouse, Joshua. He will lose his hotels. He will lose his company. He will lose absolutely everything. And he knows it, I said, pointing to the threatening emails from Carter. That's why he needs to buy this factory so desperately. He figured out that Bennett Land Holdings is registered to this address. If he buys the factory for 40 grand, he thinks he acquires the holding company, and he can renew his own ground lease before the bank finds out. Matthew laughed. A sharp, barking sound. He's terrified. Every threatening email his lawyer sends, every fake inspector he sends to your fence, it's just a desperate scream for help from a drowning man. Right on cue, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text message. Not from Julian, but from Victoria. Joshua, please. I know Julian was harsh yesterday at the cafe, but we are family. Let's stop fighting. I'm so worried about you living in that dangerous place. Can we just meet at Carter's office tomorrow and figure this out? No yelling. Just us. We want to help you. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The aggressive legal threats from Carter were the stick. Victoria's fake, tearful warmth was the carrot. They were trying to herd me into a corner, breaking me down emotionally and legally. What do you want to do? Matthew asked, leaning back in his chair, folding his arms. I stared at the text message. I remembered the cold marble of the penthouse floor. I remembered the smirk on Julian's face when he threw the rusted keys at my feet. I remembered the 5 minutes I was given to pack 6 years of my life away. I want to make them feel invincible, I said, my voice ice cold. I want them to think they've successfully broken me. I typed out a carefully crafted response to Victoria, making sure to sound pathetic. I'm exhausted, Victoria. You're right, I can't afford these legal fights with the city. The inspector was here today. I'm scared of the fines. I just want this nightmare over with. Tell Julian I'll sign the papers tomorrow at Carter's office. Just have the check ready so I can get a motel. Her reply came back in less than 10 seconds. I'm so proud of you for being reasonable, Joshua. I knew you'd come to your senses. See you tomorrow at 2 p.m. Matthew looked at the screen and grinned, showing his teeth. They're going to set a stage. They want an audience to watch you surrender. They want to show off. Let them, I said, closing the laptop. We're going to burn the stage down. Carter's law office was located in Midtown Manhattan, high up in a glittering glass skyscraper. It was exactly what you would expect from a firm that charged $1,000 an hour. The lobby featured imported Italian marble, floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking Central Park, massive mahogany tables, and an aggressive amount of confusing modern art. When I walked into the massive glass-walled conference room at exactly 2 p.m., the stage was perfectly set. Julian was sitting at the head of the long, polished conference table. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, looking completely relaxed, radiating the arrogant confidence of a king holding court. Victoria sat next to him, wearing a pristine white designer dress, sipping sparkling water from a crystal glass. Carter, the lawyer, stood off to the side, organizing a neat stack of legal documents with a smug look on his face. But as Matthew had predicted, they weren't alone. Sitting across from Julian were 2 men I didn't recognize immediately. One was an older, stern-looking man in a gray suit. The other was younger, constantly checking his phone. Julian had intentionally scheduled a funding review meeting at the exact same time as my signing. The older man was David, the senior vice president of the massive investment fund underwriting Julian's hotel expansion. The younger man was Christopher, Julian's primary business partner. Julian wanted his investors to watch him effortlessly crush a legal hurdle. He wanted to look like a master negotiator dealing with a pathetic, desperate peasant. Joshua, Julian said, standing up and opening his arms wide like a benevolent savior welcoming a lost sheep. Come in, come in. Have a seat. You look tired, buddy. I walked over, intentionally dragging my feet slightly. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table. I hunched my shoulders. I avoided eye contact. I played the part of the defeated, exhausted younger brother to absolute perfection. Carter stepped forward and slid a thick stack of papers across the polished wood, along with a heavy, expensive silver pen. "Standard transfer of property," Carter said smoothly, his voice echoing loudly in the large room, making sure the investors heard every word. "By signing this, you are transferring all rights, titles, and interests in the Red Hook property, and any and all associated corporate entities registered to that address, to Julian Bennett. In exchange, Julian is gifting you $40,000 to help you get back on your feet." David, the senior investor, checked his gold watch impatiently. "Julian, we really need to get to the collateral review for the $40 million hotel expansion. Is this family charity matter going to take much longer?" "Not at all, David," Julian smiled confidently, waving a hand dismissively in my direction. "Just doing a little charity work for my little brother. He's had a rough time adjusting to the real world. Joshua, just sign the bottom tabs where it says, Seller." I picked up the heavy silver pen. I rolled it slowly between my fingers. The room went dead silent. Everyone was watching me. Julian's eyes were locked onto the tip of the pen, practically burning a hole through the paper. He was seconds away from salvation. "I have a quick question about the Associated Corporate Entities Clause," I said quietly, looking up. Julian sighed loudly, rolling his eyes dramatically for the benefit of his investors. "Joshua, please, don't make this difficult in front of my guests. It's standard boilerplate language. Just sign it so we can move on." Before Julian could say another word, the heavy glass door of the conference room swung open with a loud click. Matthew walked in. He was wearing a razor-sharp navy suit, carrying a thick leather briefcase. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't introduce himself to the receptionist. He walked straight past Carter, straight past the investors, and stood directly at my side at the end of the table. "Excuse me, who the hell are you?" Carter demanded, his face flushing red as he stood up. "This is a private legal meeting. I am Matthew Vance, legal counsel for Mr. Joshua Bennett," Matthew said, his voice ringing with absolute, booming authority that commanded the room. He unlatched his leather briefcase and pulled out four thick, beautifully bound dossiers. He tossed one onto the table in front of Carter, slid one to Julian, and slid the last one directly down the polished wood to David, the senior investor. "What is this?" Julian snapped, his confident facade cracking instantly, his eyes darting frantically between me and Matthew. "That," I said, dropping the silver pen onto the table with a loud clatter, "is a reality check." Matthew didn't look at Julian. He looked directly at David. "Sir, I believe your firm is currently underwriting a $40 million commercial expansion loan for Julian Bennett. And I believe that loan is secured primarily by his equity in the Mercer Penthouse Tower and its management group." David narrowed his eyes, bristling at the intrusion. "That is highly confidential financial information. How do you know that? And what does it have to do with this property transfer?" "It has everything to do with it," Matthew smiled coldly, "because Julian doesn't own the ground that building sits on. He owns the concrete and glass in the sky. The land underneath the tower is owned by Bennett Land and Title Holdings, a company which is currently controlled entirely by my client, Joshua Bennett." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. Victoria froze in her chair, her glass of sparkling water stopping halfway to her mouth. "That's a lie," Julian shouted, slamming both his hands violently onto the mahogany table. "My parents owned that holding company. It defaults to the estate. I am the executor. It was transferred to an irrevocable blind trust 10 years ago," Matthew corrected smoothly, opening his own copy of the dossier. "A trust that named Joshua as the sole executor and sole beneficiary upon their passing. You tried to buy the factory for $40,000 today because you found out the holding company was registered there. You knew the 99-year ground lease on your building expires in exactly 25 days. David opened the dossier. His eyes scanned the highlighted documents at lightning speed. As a senior investment banker, he understood the catastrophic math immediately. I watched the blood drain entirely from David's face, leaving him looking like a ghost. David looked up slowly, staring at Julian with pure, unadulterated rage. The ground lease is expiring? You used a building with an expiring ground lease as primary collateral for a $40 million loan. David, listen. I can explain. It's a misunderstanding. Julian stammered, heavy sweat instantly breaking out on his forehead, his voice pitching up in panic. If a new lease isn't signed in 3 weeks, the landowner takes legal possession of the improvements. Christopher, the business partner, said, his voice trembling as he realized he was legally tied to this financial disaster. Julian, your equity goes to absolute zero. You're completely wiped out. I won't sign a renewal, I said clearly. My voice cut through the rising panic in the room like a blade. Julian whipped his head toward me. His eyes were wide with absolute terror. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy was completely gone. In his place was a desperate, cornered animal staring at a firing squad. Joshua, please, Julian begged, his voice cracking, his hands shaking as he reached across the table toward me. You can't do this. You'll ruin me. I'll lose the company. I'll lose the penthouse. I'll go to federal prison for bank fraud if the collateral zeroes out. We're brothers. I looked at him. I looked at Victoria, who was staring at me with genuine horror, her perfect, elitist mask completely shattered into a million pieces. I'm not ruining you, Julian, I said softly, leaning forward, resting my forearms on the table. I'm just refusing to save you from a massive mistake you made because you thought appearances were the same thing as ownership. You threw me out into the snow because you thought I was worthless. Now, you have 5 minutes to figure out your next move before the bank calls the police. Because I am done with you. I stood up, slowly buttoned my jacket, and walked out of the glass room, leaving them to the wolves. This is the moment that changed everything, when I finally took back control of my life. Thank you for being patient and sticking with me this far. You are amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below, so I know you are still here with me. This not only helps more people find this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. I didn't even make it to the elevator bank at the end of the hallway before the screaming started inside the conference room. Even through the thick, soundproof glass of Carter's office, I could hear David yelling at the top of his lungs. I glanced back over my shoulder. David was already on his cell phone, aggressively pacing the room, his face red with fury, barking orders to his risk management team to instantly freeze every single cent of Julian's credit lines. Christopher was shoving his finger hard into Julian's chest, shouting about filing a massive lawsuit for catastrophic misrepresentation and fraud. Carter, the high-priced lawyer who had been sending me threatening emails just yesterday, was just staring blankly at the wall. He knew he was standing at ground zero of a massive financial bomb, and his firm's name was going to be dragged through the mud. I hit the down button for the elevator. The brass doors opened, and as I stepped inside and the doors closed, I closed my eyes. I felt a massive, suffocating weight, a weight I had been carrying for 6 years, finally lift off my chest. For years, I lived in the shadow of my brother's manufactured greatness. I let him make me feel small. Now, the harsh sunlight of reality was finally hitting the truth. The chain reaction of Julian's collapse was terrifyingly fast. In the high-stakes financial world, trust is the only real currency. Once David pulled the funding and flagged the collateral as toxic, the blood was in the water. By Wednesday of that week, rumors leaked to the financial press that Julian Bennett's collateral was fraudulent. 2 other major lenders, terrified of losing their money, immediately called in their existing loans, triggering a devastating cascade of default clauses. Julian tried to scramble. He tried to liquidate his assets, but you can't sell a luxury penthouse when the land underneath it is about to revert to a hostile owner. His entire net worth was tied up in paper valuations that required a stable ground lease to exist. Without my signature renewing that lease, His empire was just a fragile castle built on sand. And the tide had just come in. And Victoria? Her fall was quieter, but just as brutal and humiliating. Victoria had built her entire career in luxury real estate brokerage on the illusion of elite stability and inside connections. She was the woman who knew everyone, who had access to the most exclusive rooms and the wealthiest clients. But the moment the lawsuit from Christopher hit the public dockets, exposing the fact that her husband had committed massive financial negligence involving a major property, she became instantly radioactive. I heard about it from Matthew a few days later over lunch. Andrew, the managing director of Victoria's elite brokerage firm, called her into his office on a Friday morning. He fired her on the spot. He didn't even let her go back to her desk to pack her own belongings. He had building security escort her directly out of the lobby. In the world of high society, people don't tolerate the stench of failure. Her wealthy friends stopped returning her calls. The exclusive country club they practically lived at suspended their membership due to unpaid dues. Exactly 1 month later, I stood across the street from the Manhattan penthouse building. It was a cold, overcast Tuesday morning. I held a cup of black coffee from a street cart, leaning against a street lamp, watching a team of professional movers carry heavy cardboard boxes out of the glittering glass lobby. There was no audience, no dramatic final speech. No screaming match, just the quiet, pathetic, unavoidable reality of a bank foreclosure. I saw Julian walk out of the lobby. He looked like he had aged 10 years in 30 days. He was wearing a plain, wrinkled gray sweater, his shoulders slumped, his eyes staring blankly at the pavement. He didn't have his brand-new Porsche anymore. The bank had seized it weeks ago to cover the outstanding interest on his defaulted loans. He climbed slowly into the passenger seat of a rented, beat-up moving van. Victoria walked out a few moments behind him. She wasn't wearing her designer sunglasses. She wasn't wearing her cashmere. She looked exhausted, her posture broken, her face pale and drawn. She didn't look like the arrogant woman who had stood in that marble foyer and given me 5 minutes to pack my bags. She looked like someone who finally understood what it meant to have absolutely nothing. The moving van started up with a sputter. They drove away, merging into the chaotic New York traffic, disappearing into the sea of yellow cabs. They didn't even look back at the building they used to rule. They lost everything because they worshipped the illusion of wealth. They thought the marble floors, the designer clothes, and the prestigious address were what made them powerful. They never bothered to look down and secure the foundation. But I did. Exactly 30 days after Julian and Victoria drove away in that rented moving van, I walked back through the revolving glass doors of the Manhattan penthouse building. I did not have a duffel bag this time. I was not being escorted out in the middle of the night. I walked straight up to the marble concierge desk. Dylan, the night concierge who had watched me leave in the freezing snow, was working the day shift. He looked up, recognized me instantly, and a wide, genuine smile broke across his face. He knew everything that had happened. The entire building knew. When a man like Julian Bennett loses his empire, the gossip spreads faster than a wildfire. Dylan handed me the master keycard without me even having to ask. I rode the private elevator up to the top floor. The doors slid open silently, and I stepped into the foyer. It was completely empty. The custom-carved oak furniture was gone. The expensive modern art that Victoria loved to brag about was stripped from the walls, leaving behind pale rectangular outlines on the expensive paint. The Persian rugs were rolled up and taken away. All that was left was the cold, echoing expanse of marble and glass. I walked slowly through the massive living room. I walked into the kitchen, running my hand along the edge of the granite countertops. I walked down the long hallway and stood in the doorway of the master bedroom. This was the exact spot where I had spent 6 years of my life. This was the room where my father took his last breath. This was the room where I had traded my salary, my career, and my own personal life to make sure my parents did not die in a sterile hospital ward. Standing there in the absolute silence, I expected to feel a massive surge of triumph. I expected to feel like a conquering king standing in the ruins of his enemy's castle. I expected to feel the ultimate vindication of my inheritance. But I did not. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the glittering New York skyline. I had the penthouse. I had the legal title. My lawyer, Matthew, had executed the lease reversion flawlessly. The building management group was now answering directly to Bennett Land and Title Holdings. I was, by every financial metric, a multimillionaire. I could have moved my things right back into that master bedroom. I could have hired the high-end interior designers Victoria was always talking about. I could have lived the exact life Julian had tried to build. But as I stood there, looking at the empty walls, I realized something incredibly profound. I did not want this place. This penthouse was beautiful, yes, but it was also a monument to vanity. It was a place designed to make other people jealous. It was a space built for taking perfectly angled photos to prove to the world that you were important. It was the very illusion that had poisoned my brother's mind and destroyed his soul. He loved the appearance of wealth so much that he completely forgot to secure the foundation of it. I did not need this address to know who I was. I did not need revenge to feel complete. Reality had already handed Julian his punishment, and I did not need to dance on his grave to find my own peace. I pulled out my phone and called Matthew. He answered on the first ring. "How does the view look from the top of the world, Joshua?" Matthew asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "It looks empty," I replied honestly. "Listen, I want you to contact a commercial leasing agency. I want to rent this entire penthouse unit out. Long-term corporate lease. Take the revenue generated from the rent and funnel it directly into the operating accounts for Bennett Land and Title Holdings." Matthew was silent for a moment. "You are not going to live there, Joshua? It is one of the premier properties in the city." "I know," I said, turning away from the window and walking back toward the elevator. "But it is not my home. My home is in Brooklyn. The place that mattered most to me was never that apartment. It was the factory. The building they had tossed at me like an insult became the clearest proof of everything they had failed to understand. The next morning, I drove my own truck back to Red Hook. The winter snow had finally melted, leaving behind a crisp, bright spring morning. I unlocked the heavy steel door of the factory, but this time I did not just go to the underground biometric vault. I walked into the center of the massive, debris-filled industrial floor. I put on a pair of heavy leatherwork gloves, grabbed a push broom, and went to work. I spent the next 3 months transforming that building. I used the initial revenue from the Bennett Holdings accounts to hire the best commercial contractors in the city. But I did not sit in an office and watch them work. I was out there every single day in the dust and the noise. We cleared out decades of rusted machinery and broken glass. We power-washed the brick exterior until the original deep red color shined through, keeping the rugged, historical character of the building intact. I oversaw the restoration of the upper administrative offices, completely replacing the outdated electrical wiring and installing high-speed fiber optic internet. We reinforced the steel beams. We knocked down the rotting interior walls to create a massive, open-concept floor plan on the main level. I kept the biometric vault completely sealed and hidden, a quiet tribute to my father's brilliance, serving as the secure server room for the entire facility. I did not turn the factory into luxury condos. I did not flip it to a massive real estate developer for a quick cash out. I turned the old industrial floor into a training and startup space for young people in Brooklyn who needed somewhere to begin. I named it the Bennett Foundation. I wanted to create an incubator for kids who grew up in the neighborhoods around Red Hook. Kids who had brilliant minds and incredible work ethics, but who did not have a massive college fund to fall back on. Kids who would never be handed a high-paying corporate salary just because their parents knew the right country club members. Not everyone inherits a safe start. Not everyone gets handed a polished address and a room full of people ready to believe in them. I wanted that building to become a place where skill mattered more than status. I wanted a space where discipline mattered more than image, where people could build something real, even if nobody had ever expected much from them. We brought in mentors. We hosted coding boot camps, small business financial planning seminars, and trade skill workshops. We offered free office space and high-end equipment to young entrepreneurs who could pitch a solid, sustainable business plan. I walked the floors every single day. I talked to these kids. I listened to their struggles. I saw the hunger in their eyes. It was the exact same hunger I had felt when I was sitting in that coffee shop, watching my brother try to buy my future for pennies. One afternoon, about a year after the factory opened its doors, I was sitting in the main common area, helping a young woman named Maya review a commercial lease agreement for her new logistics startup. She was brilliant, fiercely determined, and completely terrified of the legal jargon. I spent 2 hours patiently breaking down the clauses for her, showing her exactly where the hidden liabilities were, teaching her how to negotiate from a position of strength rather than fear. When we finally finished, she closed her laptop, looked at me, and let out a long breath. "Thank you, Joshua," she said, her voice full of genuine gratitude. "Nobody has ever taken the time to explain this to me. I always thought you needed an expensive lawyer to understand this game." "You don't need an expensive lawyer, Maya," I smiled. "You just need to know how to read the foundation. You need to know what you are standing on before you start building the walls." As she walked away to share the good news with her business partners, I looked around the bustling, vibrant factory floor. Sunlight was streaming through the newly replaced industrial windows, illuminating a space filled with energy, collaboration, and genuine hard work. There were no silk robes here. There were no designer sunglasses or fake smiles. There was only the raw, beautiful reality of people building their own futures from the ground up. I thought about Julian. I had not spoken to him since the day I walked out of that glass conference room. Matthew kept tabs on the legal fallout for a while. The divorce between Julian and Victoria happened almost immediately after the bankruptcy filings. When the money ran out, the loyalty evaporated. Victoria fought tooth and nail in the divorce proceedings, trying to secure whatever scraps of assets were left, even going after the phantom college fund they had supposedly set up for a child they never had. The custody battle over their remaining dignity was brutal and public. Julian eventually moved out of state, taking a mid-level management position at a budget hotel chain in the Midwest. He was a man who had flown too close to the sun on wings made of rented paper, and when the paper burned, the fall was absolute. I felt a brief pang of sadness for him, but it faded quickly. Julian made his choices. He chose the illusion over the reality. He chose the applause of strangers over the loyalty of his own blood. I chose the factory, and in doing so, I finally found the life I was always meant to live. It has been 3 years since the cold winter night I was thrown out onto the street with nothing but a duffel bag and a rusted ring of keys. Late yesterday evening, after all the young entrepreneurs had packed up their laptops and gone home, I walked up the metal stairs to the roof of the Red Hook factory. The air was warm, carrying the salty scent of the East River. The sky was turning a deep, bruised purple as the sun set behind the massive, glittering skyline of Manhattan across the water. I leaned against the brick parapet and looked out at the city. Far in the distance, I could just barely make out the specific glass tower where the penthouse sat. It was just another glowing rectangle in a forest of steel and light. I stood there for a long time, listening to the hum of the city, thinking about the incredible, terrifying, beautiful journey that had brought me to this exact spot. In the end, that was the ultimate lesson my parents left me, and it took losing them to finally understand it. My father and mother spent their entire lives building a quiet, unshakable empire. They did not buy yachts. They did not throw extravagant parties to impress people they secretly despised. They invested in the dirt. They invested in the foundation. They understood that real value is usually quiet. It does not always look impressive at first glance. It does not beg for attention, and it does not need to be photographed to be powerful. The things that truly hold a life together, loyalty, patience, deep knowledge, and quiet strength, are often the exact things shallow people overlook because they are too busy chasing what sparkles. Julian and Victoria thought ownership meant possession. They thought that just because they held the keys to a luxury apartment, they were untouchable. They thought power meant access to the right clubs and the right tables. They thought if something looked expensive, it had to be the ultimate prize. But they never stopped to ask what their entire life was standing on. They never bothered to check the roots of the tree they were so proudly sitting in. I did. I read the files. I did the heavy lifting. I spent 6 years doing the unglamorous, heartbreaking work of caregiving, learning the true meaning of duty and sacrifice. That is why they lost, and it is why I survived. I am speaking directly to you now, whoever is watching this, wherever you are. If you have ever been the person in the background, if you have ever been underestimated because you were patient, because you were quiet, because your strengths were not obvious to people who only respect loud noises and flashy displays, remember this. The strongest part of any structure is rarely the part on display. You are the rebar inside the concrete. You are the deep foundation that keeps the house from collapsing when the storm hits. People might walk all over you. They might ignore you. They might even try to throw you out into the cold because they do not understand your worth. But sooner or later, life has a way of revealing who built their future on something real, and who only decorated the surface. Keep building your foundation. Keep doing the quiet work. Do not let the arrogant, flashy people in your life make you feel small. Because when the ground lease of life finally expires, the people holding the solid dirt are the ones who inherit the world. Now, before I sign off, I want to leave you with one final thought, an educational takeaway from all the chaos, the legal battles, and the family betrayal. If my story teaches you anything, let it be the critical difference between perceived wealth and actual ownership. We live in a society that is absolutely obsessed with the exterior. We are trained to admire the luxury car, the massive house, the impressive job title. But true security is never found in things you can lease, finance, or fake. True security is found in the unglamorous details. Reading the contracts, understanding your legal rights, managing your assets wisely, and building a foundation that no bank, no market crash, and no greedy relative can ever take away from you. Do not leverage your future on borrowed ground. Whether it is in business, in your relationships, or in your own personal development, always ask yourself, what is this standing on? If the foundation is rotten, no amount of expensive paint will save the house. Build slowly. Build quietly. Build with integrity. I want to hear from you now. What is the one lesson or takeaway from this story that resonated with you the most? Share your perspective in the comments below. Or, if this story simply brought you some value and a good reminder about life, just comment the word good, so I know you were here with me until the very end. Your interaction means the world to me, and it helps push these important lessons to others who might need to hear them today. Thank you for watching, and stay strong.